When you think of heavenly horsemen in the Bible, you generally think of the four horsemen. These riders are simple to describe, as is shown by the fact that a mere 8 verses are given about them, but they are also somewhat difficult to explain. They have inspired art, new eschatologies, and a plethora of commentaries. But the idea of horsemen from heaven is not a new one. While the origins of the motif are unclear, much of biblical literature speaks to a long-standing tradition of divine equestrians. Today, we will explore the references and describe how these riders found their way into Jewish tradition and why, as we discuss the heavenly horsemen. There are conflicting sources within the Bible on whether or not Yahweh enjoyed iron chariots or chariots in general. Famously, in Judges 1:19, the Israelites are focusing on removing the last of the Canaanites from the land. We are told that the Lord was with the men of Judah. They took possession of the hill country, but they were unable to drive the people from the plains because they had chariots fitted with iron. While the iron chariots seem to have been difficult for the Israelites to overcome, the verse, taken at face value, seems to portray that Yahweh is powerless against the iron chariots. After all, God was with the men of Judah. Additionally, in the many wars and battles that we read about in the narratives of Joshua through 2 Kings, excluding Ruth, the Deuteronomistic history, the men of Israel rarely use chariots or horses in their battles, and when they do use chariots in battle, they are either useless or under the rule of a king that was described as evil. An exception would be when David took chariots and horses in battle, but we are not told that these were ever used in any of his battles afterwards. From this, and some other passages we will discuss in depth later, it seems that the people of Israel were not necessarily fans of horsemen, chariots, or cavalry. This might be due to the equestrian tendencies of many of their enemies throughout history. When the Babylonian exile took place in the early years of the 6th century BCE, there was very little of what we would today call biblical canon. Written during the exile, or perhaps shortly after, the text of the book of Jeremiah reports that Jeremiah, the prophet, had predicted that the righteous Israel, if the people would simply obey God's law, would have horses and chariotry. This is noted in 2 places in the book. Firstly, in Jeremiah 17:24-25. But if you are careful to obey me, declares the Lord, and bring no load through the gates of this city on the Sabbath, but keep the Sabbath day holy by not doing any work on it, then kings who sit on David's throne will come through the gates of this city with their officials. They and their officials will come riding in chariots and on horses, accompanied by the men of Judah and those living in Jerusalem, and this city will be inhabited forever. This point is further expanded upon in Jeremiah 22:3-4. This is what the Lord says: Do what is just and right. Rescue from the hand of the oppressor the one who has been robbed. Do no wrong or violence to the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place. For if you are careful to carry out these commands, then kings who sit on David's throne will come through the gates of this palace, riding in chariots and on horses, accompanied by their officials and their people. Should we, then, accept that the Israelites wanted chariots and horses, or not? Perhaps to the ancient Israelites, these equestrian themes were reserved for when one is exalted above their enemies. In any case, 1 Isaiah reports in chapter 30 that during the Assyrian invasion, the Israelites did, in fact, seek horses and chariotry. We will return to this chapter later, but for now it's important to note that God was criticizing the people for asking the Egyptians for their assistance instead of relying on him. God mocks the people, saying, "You said, 'No, we will flee on horses, therefore you will flee.' You said, 'We will ride off on swift horses, therefore your pursuers will be swift.'" Isaiah 30:16. Although I could not find the manuscript, at least one English translation, the New Living Translation, adds that these horses were obtained from Egypt. This is further supported by the reference to the Israelites getting their horses from Egypt in Isaiah 36:9. If the reference in 30:16 does not reference Egypt, we can conclude that the translators, either of the New Living Translation or the copyist, interpolated it from 36:9. Either way, there is enough evidence to support that the Israelites got their horses from Egypt, and this was seen as a bad thing. If the Israelites were getting their horses from Egypt at this time, it would have been before the writing of Deuteronomy. There was a specific law against getting horses from Egypt. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them, for the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. Deuteronomy 17:16. It seems that this directive was in response to the Israelites gathering their horses from Egypt. Here we can also reference the call for destruction of horses and chariotry that was commanded by God to Joshua in Joshua 11:6. The Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them, because by this time tomorrow I will hand all of them, slain, over to Israel. You are to hamstring their horses and burn their chariots." We are left with two opposing views here. The exilic and post-exilic Israelites were against the use of horses and chariotry, especially if they came from Egypt. This would have been in opposition to the earlier practice of getting horses from Egypt during the Assyrian invasion. At some point in time, this practice had begun to be looked down upon and interpreted as one of the many sins that led Israel to sin, a theological framework that contained the ultimate consequence of the exile. Earlier, we discussed the possibility that chariots and horsemen were used as symbols of exultation over others. In many cases, these were reserved for the enemies of Israel, the ones who had oppressed the people of the nation. In some cases in the Old Testament, however, these symbols are used positively as a way to show the power of God. When used positively, the chariots and horsemen are shown to be from God himself. For example, in 2 Kings 2, Elijah ascends to heaven on a fiery chariot from heaven. As they were walking along and talking, suddenly a chariot of fire appeared, drawn by horses of fire. It drove between the two men, separating them, and Elijah was carried by a whirlwind into heaven. Elisha, the successor to Elijah, exclaims that he has seen the chariots and charioteers of Israel. Later, in 2 Kings 6, when the Arameans are at war with Israel, Elisha shows his servant a vision of fiery chariots. His servant had been distraught over the fact that there were troops, horses, and chariots everywhere. Elisha told him that there were, in fact, more on his side than on the side of the Arameans. He prays to God to open his servant's eyes, and when they are opened, the servant sees that the hillside around Elisha was filled with horses and chariots of fire. Furthermore, in 2 Kings 13:14, Jehoash, the king of Israel, came to Elisha and proclaimed that he had seen the chariots and charioteers of Israel. This set the stage for Elisha's final prophecy just before his death. This was a poetic endnote to the story of Elisha as a prophet. His story ended just as it had begun. The visions of horsemen and chariots in the Elijah-Elisha cycle is markedly different from the other equestrian visions we will discuss, so this seems as good a time as any to analyze what we have covered thus far. The visions of heavenly horsemen in the Elijah-Elisha cycle is quick and requires no exposition by another divine being. The message is simple. When Elijah was ascending, Elisha saw a heavenly chariot physically carrying him away. During the battle against the Arameans, the chariots were clearly there, but in a dimension that is not our own. In the narratives, these heavenly horsemen are real beings doing real things in real time, while other events continue to happen around them. They are not removed from the scenes, but intrinsically linked to them, all while remaining invisible to normal human eyes unless God opens them. This is in contrast to the other equestrian visions we will discuss. In the book of Zechariah, the prophet receives multiple visions in which an angel provides explanations for what he's seeing. The first vision of heavenly horsemen appears in Zechariah 1:7-17. Here, Zechariah sees a man on a red horse. Behind him are 3 men on red, brown, and white horses. We are told that the Lord sent them to patrol the earth. The riders then tell the angel that the earth is at peace. At the end of this vision, God promises peace and flourishing for his people. We cannot interpret this vision without considering the vision of chariots later in the same book. In Zechariah 6:1-8, we are told that Zechariah received a vision of chariots, unlike the first one of horsemen without chariots. The first chariot is pulled by red horses, the second by black horses, the third by white horses, and the fourth by dappled gray horses. These are described as the 4 winds, often translated as spirits, of heaven, that go do the Lord's work. Just as the 4 horsemen in the earlier vision, these too go to patrol the earth. The chariot with the black horses is said to go north. The chariot with the gray horses is said to go south, and the chariot with the white horses is said to go west. It has long been noted that of the 4 cardinal directions, only 3 have been listed, and there does not seem to be a satisfactory answer to this problem. While the scenes seem to resemble a time of peace, Max Rogland argues that verse 5, properly understood, suggests a time of rebellion against the Lord. His paper is sourced in the description, and a more technical form of the argument can be found there. However, Rogland notes that the patrols report that all the earth is at peace in 1:11, when coupled with the angel of Yahweh's lament in verse 12, implies that the time is ripe for judgment on the earth. The subsequent references to the Lord's zeal for Jerusalem, verse 14, and his great wrath against the nations, verse 15, further imply forthcoming punishment rather than peaceful diplomacy. Verse 5 is generally translated as, "The angel answered me." These are the 4 winds of heaven going out from standing in the presence of the Lord of the whole world. Rogland's view is that standing in the presence of the Lord, or standing before the Lord, should be understood as standing for or fighting for the Lord. That is, they are on the Lord's side and defend in his name. In any case, the point of the passages is that God controls all. When devastating forces come upon a people, it is God's will, and it is just. The horsemen and charioteers have it all under control. The need for heavenly chariots and horsemen seems to arise in times of strife. This is supported not only by the references we have already examined, but also by a passage from Habakkuk. During a prayer to God, although probably a later addition, Habakkuk references the parting of the sea by Moses. "Was it in anger, Lord, that you struck the rivers and parted the sea? Were you displeased with them? No, you were sending your chariots of salvation." Habakkuk 3:8. There are different translations of this verse, but it seems that the Exodus narrative is in mind no matter how one translates it. This passage suggests that the ancient Israelites viewed their rescue in battle as being the result of God's protection. To symbolize this, they used the imagery of God as a divine warrior. This idea already had great antiquity by the time Habakkuk was around. In fact, Yahweh would have originally been a war and storm god. However, that topic should be left for another video. If you would like more information on that, I suggest reading Thomas Romer's work, The Invention of God. Furthermore, the imagery in the rest of Habakkuk chapter 3 seems to take up this imagery as well. This includes bows, arrows, and spears. Earlier, we discussed the use of horsemen and chariots in the stories of Elijah and Elisha. In these, the heavenly beings seem to be very real and are set in the scene. This theme would be taken up again twice in 2 Maccabees. In 2 Maccabees 3:24-28, a heavenly horseman and 2 other divine beings come down to stop Heliodorus in his tracks. It seems that he's the only one able to see them, but just as in the ascension of Elijah, they do very real things. In this case, they punish Heliodorus with lashes. There is a clear Hellenistic motif in this passage. The beings are said to be wearing golden armor. Later in the book, in 2 Maccabees 10:24-31, we learn of a battle taking place between the Jews and the forces of Timothy. During this battle, we are told that 5 heavenly horsemen appear to the opponents to defend the Jews and Maccabeus. We are only told that the enemies see this, and the question of their appearing to the Jews is still left open. Although if we follow the heavenly horseman motif that we have been discussing, it's reasonable to assume that they did not. Interestingly, in this narrative we are told that the horsemen threw thunderbolts. This wasn't a novel image to the Jews. Let's quickly return to Zechariah and discuss chapter 9. This was likely written in the 5th century. The Lord's arrows are said to fly like lightning. Zechariah 9:14. There's an oddity in the passage in 2 Maccabees. There were 5 heavenly horsemen that came to the aid of the Jews. There are multiple hypotheses that could explain this reference, but the issue is far from settled. If we return to Isaiah 30, God says to the disobedient Israelites that 5 of them will make you flee. Isaiah 30:17. The passage in 2 Maccabees then could be seen as a reversal of the words of God, in a way saying that the Jews are now obedient and trust in the Lord. Therefore, the consequence that was once toward them is now inflicted on their enemies, although the question still remains open. It is noteworthy to point out that the Maccabean revolt was applied to the passage in Zechariah and seen as a fulfillment, as was noted by the church father Jerome in his commentary on Zechariah. In fact, many prophecies about the advancement of the Assyrians were applicable to the Seleucids. We have now covered numerous references to heavenly horsemen and chariotry during the periods of the divided monarchy through the Second Temple period. What conclusions can we draw from this? It seems that the aversion to horsemen and chariotry led ancient Israelites and Jews to view their own equestrian forces as being from God. On the occasions they would need these things, the Lord would provide. In a way, this can be viewed as a direct competitor to the horsemen and chariotry of Israel's enemies. A way of saying, yes, you have powerful horses and chariots, but ours are better. Naturally, this would have built off the imagery of Yahweh as a divine warrior. We can now turn to one of the most famous horseman scenes in the Bible. In fact, one of the most famous scenes in the Bible overall. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. If you're not familiar with the text, I recommend watching our video on the subject. Revelation contains a series of visions by John of Patmos, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls. Each one of them describes the same end-time event from different perspectives. The main point of these visions is to drive home the point that Jesus Christ is the Lord over history. He has the authority and power to set events in motion. Multiple times in these visions, Jesus' lordship is announced. With the vision of the 7 seals, the first 4 are identified as the 4 horsemen in Revelation 6, 1-8. Each rider comes in when one of the 4 creatures who are standing around the throne of God, described in chapter 4, shout, "Come!" to them. Sometimes this is understood to mean that the creatures are telling the seer to come, hence the alternative reading, "Come and see." The term erku, usually translated as come, can also be translated as go. It's possible the reading "come and see" was the result of confusion over why these terrifying creatures would be sent out by God himself. Therefore, the later addition to the text acted as a way to show that instead of the horseman being addressed, it was John who was being addressed, thereby removing the theological hurdle. The first rider comes on a white horse, wearing a crown and carrying a bow. Already, there's quite a lot to unpack. Firstly, why is the horse white? White is often seen as a color of victory or glorification in the Bible. Because the horse is white, many interpreters have argued that this rider is Jesus, because Jesus is clearly the rider on the white horse in Revelation 19. Furthermore, according to Matthew 24:14 and Luke 21:12, the gospel first had to be preached to all nations. This is unlikely, however, as Jesus is the one opening the seals. This horseman, then, might be a reference to the Parthian threat to the east. At this point in time, at the end of the 1st century, the only known mounted riders who were skilled with bows were the Parthians. Our modern vernacular even has a hint of this when we say Parthian shot. Furthermore, white was also a color frequently used by the Parthians. This rider was meant to symbolize conquest, specifically wars between states. I emphasize that this is war between states because it's distinct from the next rider. This is the rider on a red horse. He was given a sword and the power to take peace from the earth so men would slaughter one another. Red, very obviously, is the color of bloodshed. Even though this rider has a sword, he does not kill anyone. Instead, the men kill each other. Distinct from the conquest of the first rider, which implies war, this rider represents civil war. How do we know? It's very likely that John of Patmos was influenced by a passage from Mark. In Mark 13, 7-13, we can read the synoptic apocalypse. Keep in mind that the Greek term apokalypsis, the first word in Revelation, just means unveiling. Divine knowledge is being revealed here, making this an apocalypse. This is where we find the famous prophecy about the destruction of the temple. Some of Jesus' disciples asked him, "When will all this happen? What sign will you show us that these things are about to be fulfilled?" Mark 13:4. Jesus informs them that there will be false messiahs, war, and threats of war. Nation will war against nation, earthquakes, famines, and persecutions. Many of these describe what is happening in the horseman scene in Revelation. Famine is clearly identified, but the distinction between war and threats of war and nation will war against nation are two distinct categories that can only be understood as civil war and conquest, respectively. Since the rider on the red horse is meant to be civil war, this might symbolize the end of Pax Augustea, a long period of peace for Rome, although the peace was only within the Roman Empire. However, there had been a plethora of rebellions leading up to the time of John's writing near the end of the 1st century. These could be what John had in mind when writing his work, especially if he had the synoptic apocalypse in mind at the time. The third rider comes in on a black horse. This horseman enters with a pair of scales in his hand. When the rider is in full view and going out, a voice can be heard in the midst of the 4 creatures saying, "A measure of wheat for a denarius, and 3 measures of barley for a denarius, but do not harm the oil and the wine." Firstly, let's concentrate on the scale and its significance. In the Bible, a balance is often used as a symbol of famine. For example, in Leviticus 26:26, "When I cut off your supply of bread, 10 women will be able to bake your bread in one oven, and they will dole out the bread by weight. You will eat, but you will not be satisfied." This imagery of distributing food by weight can also be found in Ezekiel 4:16. "He then said to me, 'Son of man, I am about to cut off the food supply in Jerusalem. The people will eat rationed food in anxiety and drink rationed water in despair.'" The fact that food has to be rationed and carefully weighed for distribution implies a scale. Hence, the third rider denotes famine. This is different than starvation. In each of the cases described, Revelation, Leviticus, and Ezekiel, the people don't starve to death. Rather, food is scarce and must be rationed. Further adding to this imagery is what the voice says about food prices and which products will be available. A denarius was a full day's pay. The point is quite clear. The cost is incredibly high. There is also most likely a contemporary reference here to the reign of Domitian. During his reign, there was a famine in Asia Minor. Bread costs were twice as high, and in 91 CE, Domitian ordered that no new vineyards be planted. He also ordered that many of the existing ones be destroyed to make room for cereals. As to be expected, there was such an outcry against this that the order was repealed. This not only explains the reference to the famine, but also the reference to the oil and wine. Finally, we must briefly examine the voice in the midst that spoke those haunting words. I am of the opinion that this refers to the voice of the exalted Jesus. We are told that the voice was in the midst of the 4 creatures, and in chapter 5, we learned that this is exactly where the Lamb, Jesus, was standing. "Then I saw a lamb, looking as if it had been slain, standing at the center of the throne, encircled by the 4 living creatures and the elders." Revelation 5:6. The 4th and final horseman is Death. He comes riding in on a pale horse with Hades by his side. This scene is not only iconic, but it contains a lot of exegetical insights that can only be attained through the Greek. Chloros, the word usually translated as pale, is better understood as a yellowish-green color. It's best to view this horse as having the color of decaying flesh. This is put into a much better context when we take a look at the name of the rider. The word translated as death is thanatos. This is better understood as death by pestilence. Considering the meaning of chloros, the color of the horse, this identification makes all the more sense. We are now prepared to look at the unit for what it is and give it a final examination. Why are there 4 horsemen? And more specifically, why are they identified the way they are? We have already discussed the synoptic apocalypse, which mentions many of the same ideas. The one difference is that the earthquakes prophesied by Jesus are replaced with death by disease in Revelation. A clearer parallel can be found in Ezekiel 14:21. "For this is what the sovereign Lord says, how much worse will it be when I send against Jerusalem my 4 dreadful judgments, sword and famine, and wild beasts and plague, to kill its men and their animals." These 4 dreadful punishments are exactly the ills that we see described in Revelation 6:8. They were given power over 1/4 of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. Sword would be a reference to the civil war discussed above. Plague would be a reference to the 4th horseman. Famine's identification is obvious, but this leaves us with the wild beasts. Why, instead of conquest, does John list wild beasts? Perhaps this is an allusion to the 4 beasts in Daniel, which are zoomorphisms of Israel's enemies. John of Patmos, just as the writer of 2 Maccabees, had taken the motif of heavenly horsemen to a whole new level. He played off the intricate relationships between the world he lived in and the imagery in his scriptures. While ancient Israelites didn't hold chariots and horses in the highest regard, it's clear they saw the advantage of them in times of war. If and when Israel was in need of cavalry, God would provide. His horses and his chariots would succeed above all. Most importantly, for writers like John and Zechariah, God had ultimate control of these forces, and they do his will. In my view, these iconic scenes become even more powerful when the motif of heavenly horsemen can be fully appreciated. Thanks for watching. If you haven't yet, be sure to like and subscribe. If you enjoy our content and want to help support this channel, check out our Patreon and Teespring links in the description. If you don't want to spend money but still see what we're doing outside of YouTube, make sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We'll see you next time.